The first thing I became aware of was the cold, deep and pervasive, the kind that gnawed at the bones and chilled the soul. I opened my eyes to a ceiling that sagged under years of neglect, its plaster peeling in long, jagged strips like a second skin trying to shed. The air smelled of damp stone and mildew, a cloying scent that clung to the back of my throat. I sat up slowly, my limbs stiff and uncooperative. Around me, the room stretched wide and hollow, lit dimly by a pale, flickering light that seeped in through cracked windows veiled with grime. The silence was immense, broken only by the distant sound of dripping water, a maddening rhythm that seemed to echo forever. I couldn't remember how I'd come to be here. My mind felt like a frayed film reel, glimpses of people and places flashing in disjointed fragments before vanishing into oblivion. My name. What was my name? Panic stirred, a creeping unease prickling at the edges of my awareness, but I forced it down. I needed to focus. The room I was in was sparse and unsettling in its simplicity. A rusted bed frame with no mattress, a chair with one leg shorter than the others, and a broken mirror hung at an odd angle on the wall. My reflection stared back at me, a gaunt face with hollow eyes, as unfamiliar to me as the room itself. A sound, a faint shuffle, barely audible, reached me from beyond the door. I froze. Hello? My voice cracked in the stillness, swallowed almost instantly by the oppressive silence. No response. The shuffle came again, this time closer. I stood, legs trembling, as I approached the door. It was old and heavy, its surface marked with deep gouges and scratches as though something had clawed at it in desperation. I hesitated, pressing my ear to the wood. The air on the other side felt alive, vibrating faintly with something I couldn't name. The knob turned with a creak, and I stepped into a hallway that seemed to stretch on forever. Its walls were streaked with grime, the faint remnants of institutional green paint peeling to reveal cracked plaster beneath. Doors lined the corridor, each one identical, each one closed. Above me, fluorescent lights buzzed and flickered, casting sickly shadows that danced on the floor. "Where am I?" I whispered to the void. The silence that followed was not a natural stillness. It was a silence that seemed to watch and wait, an expectant hush that pressed against my ears like the weight of deep water. I began walking, my footsteps muffled by the damp, uneven floor. As I passed the doors, a strange sensation crept over me. A faint pull, as though the asylum itself were breathing, its exhalations tugging me deeper into its lungs. I hadn't gone far when I first noticed the sound. It was faint at first, barely distinguishable from the hum of the flickering lights, but it grew steadily louder, a soft, rhythmic tapping, like fingers drumming against metal. I turned, expecting to see someone, anything, but the hallway behind me was empty, stretching into shadow. The sound stopped as abruptly as it had begun, leaving me stranded in a suffocating silence. "Keep moving," I told myself, my voice trembling. The tapping resumed, closer this time. I quickened my pace, the echo of my footsteps merging with the noise until I could no longer tell where one ended and the other began. I reached a corner and turned sharply, pressing myself against the wall. My breath came fast and shallow, misting in the cold air. The tapping grew louder, accompanied now by a soft scraping that set my teeth on edge. I dared a glance around the corner. Nothing. The hallway was empty, just as it had been before. But the air felt heavier now, as though something unseen had passed through and lingered just out of sight. I forced myself to move, each step feeling like a gamble, every shadow a potential threat. The sound followed, a predator's rhythm that never wavered, never faltered. It wasn't hurried, as though whatever was making it knew I couldn't escape, as though it was savoring the chase. Doors loomed on either side of me, their metal surfaces warped with age. I tried one at random, desperate for refuge. It opened with a groan, revealing a room that reeked of damp earth and disuse. I stepped inside, the dim light of the hallway spilling across the floor in uneven stripes. The room was cluttered with objects, medical equipment long abandoned, their rusted frames bent and broken. A wheelchair sat in the center, its wheels locked at an odd angle, as though it had been pushed and then forgotten. The tapping stopped. The silence that followed was absolute, more suffocating than any noise. I held my breath, listening for anything, any sign that I was alone. The wheelchair moved. It was subtle at first, a faint creak as one wheel shifted. Then, slowly, deliberately, it rolled forward an inch. I stumbled back, my pulse roaring in my ears. "Who's there?" The shadows didn't answer. And then, just beyond the doorway, the tapping resumed. This time it was joined by another sound, soft and low, like a breath drawn in a place where no lungs should be. The hunter had found me. The tapping grew louder, each deliberate note echoing like a drumbeat in a vast, unseen theater. I pressed my back against the cold wall of the room, heart hammering in sync with the sound. The doorway framed a sliver of the hallway, the flickering light casting wild shadows that seemed to pulse in time with the rhythm. And then, silence. The absence of sound was worse than the noise itself. My breath caught, and I waited, every nerve on edge, for the tapping to resume. Seconds stretched into what felt like hours. Slowly I stepped forward, inching toward the doorway to peer into the hall. Nothing. The hallway was empty, the oppressive quiet stretching endlessly in both directions. I exhaled shakily, trying to convince myself it was just my imagination, that the asylum's atmosphere was playing tricks on my senses. Then I noticed the footprints. They weren't mine. Dark, wet imprints trailed across the floor, leading from the doorway to the far end of the hall where the shadows pooled thickly. The prints were large and uneven, as though made by something not entirely human. A shiver rippled through me. I should have turned back. I should have run. But instead, I followed. The corridor stretched ahead, twisting and turning in ways that made no sense. Doors loomed on either side, their surfaces battered and scratched, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something, or someone, was behind those doors, watching. The footprints veered suddenly, leading into a room with its door ajar. A flickering light spilled into the hall, faint and sickly yellow. My feet felt like lead as I approached, the urge to look inside warring with the instinct to flee. I stepped into the room. The air was colder here, tinged with a metallic scent that made my stomach churn. A single bulb swung lazily from the ceiling, casting long, jittery shadows that seemed to move of their own accord. The room was filled with shelves lined with jars of murky liquid, their contents too distorted to make out. But what caught my attention was the wall. It was covered in photographs, black and white images pinned haphazardly in overlapping rows. Faces stared back at me, blank, haunted expressions frozen in time. Men, women, children. Some looked ordinary, others grotesquely altered, their features distorted in ways that made my skin crawl. At the center of the wall was a single word, scrawled in jagged letters across the peeling paint. Listen. A faint sound reached me then, a whisper, soft and indistinct, like a voice carried on a distant wind. It wasn't coming from the hall, it was inside the room. I turned slowly, scanning the shadows for the source. The whisper grew louder, joined by others until it became a cacophony of voices, overlapping and merging into a single, mournful wail. And then I saw it. At the far corner of the room, a figure stood partially obscured by the flickering shadows. Its form was indistinct, its edges blurring as though it were not entirely solid. It swayed gently, as though caught in a breeze only it could feel. "Why are you here?" The voice came clear and cold, cutting through the chaos. I stumbled back, my gaze locked on the figure. "I don't know," I whispered. The voices fell silent. The figure tilted its head, and for the briefest moment, it stepped closer, just enough for me to see its face. It wasn't human. Its features were warped, stretched unnaturally as though pulled apart and rearranged. But its eyes were piercing and bright, filled with something ancient and unreadable. "You shouldn't have come," it said, before dissolving into the shadows. The figure's words lingered in the air long after it had vanished, their weight pressing heavily on my mind. I stumbled out of the room, my head spinning as though the asylum itself were tilting beneath my feet. The hallway felt different now, narrower, darker. The lights above flickered erratically, casting more shadows than light. I hurried forward, desperate to put distance between myself and whatever was haunting these halls. That's when I saw the symbols. They were etched into the walls, faint at first, but growing bolder and more intricate the farther I went. Circles within circles, lines intersecting at impossible angles, symbols that seemed to hum with a faint, otherworldly energy. They drew me forward as though guiding me towards something unseen. The corridor ended abruptly, opening into a vast chamber that shouldn't have been possible within the asylum's confines. The ceiling rose high above, lost in shadow, and the walls were lined with more of the strange symbols, glowing faintly in the darkness. In the center of the room was a structure, a massive mechanical contraption that looked both ancient and futuristic. It pulsed with a rhythmic light, each flicker casting the room in shifting shades of black and gold. I stepped closer, unable to resist its pull. The machine seemed alive, its gears turning soundlessly, its core emitting a low, resonant hum. As I approached, the air grew heavy, thick with an invisible force that pressed against my chest. My reflection appeared on the machine's surface, distorted and fractured into a dozen versions of myself, each one staring back with an expression of fear. "You've come far," a voice said, breaking the silence. I spun around, but the room was empty. "You're close now," it continued, emanating from the very air around me. "But the truth will not set you free." The lights pulsed faster, and I realized with dawning horror that the machine wasn't just a thing, it was a door. And something was trying to come through. The room felt alive, breathing in sync with the pulsating light of the machine. Each flicker cast strange shadows that writhed and twisted against the walls, their movements far too deliberate to be tricks of the eye. The hum grew louder, resonating through the chamber, a low, bone-deep vibration that made my teeth ache. I stumbled backward, my gaze fixed on the machine's core, a swirling mass of light and shadow that defied comprehension. It wasn't just a portal, it was something ancient, something alive. "Turn back," the voice whispered, sharp and cold. "Who are you?" I demanded, though my voice trembled under the weight of the room's oppressive silence. "You," the voice replied. The words struck me like a physical blow, the air leaving my lungs in a single panicked gasp. The reflections in the machine shifted, their fractured forms aligning, merging into a single clear image. Me. My own face stared back at me, pale and hollow-eyed, lips moving in perfect sync with the voice. "Turn back," it repeated. A part of me wanted to listen, to flee back down the dark corridors and leave this place behind forever. But the machine's pull was relentless, a gravitational force that drew me closer with every beat of its flickering light. The symbols on the walls began to shift, their lines bleeding into one another, forming new patterns that seemed to pulse with an almost musical rhythm. I felt them in my bones, their alien geometry resonating with something deep within me, as though they were unlocking a door I hadn't known existed. I stepped closer to the machine, unable to resist the magnetic pull. The air around it shimmered, bending and warping the light until it felt like I was peering through a ripple in reality itself. "What do you want from me?" I whispered. The voice didn't answer. Instead, the machine's core flared brighter, the swirling mass expanding until it filled the room with a blinding radiance. For a moment, I saw nothing but white, an endless void that seemed to stretch into infinity. And then, I saw the hunter. It was standing just beyond the machine's light, a towering figure cloaked in shadow, its form shifting and dissolving like smoke. Its presence was suffocating, a weight that pressed down on my chest and filled my veins with ice. It didn't move, didn't speak, but its intent was clear. It wanted me. The reflections in the machine shifted again, and I realized with dawning horror that the faces staring back weren't mine anymore. They were other versions of me, older, younger, twisted, and broken. Each one bore the same expression: fear. "You have come full circle," the voice said, its tone hollow and distant. "What does that mean?" I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted to know. "The machine is the asylum. The asylum is you." The words sent a shiver through me, their meaning elusive yet undeniable. I felt the truth of them in my bones, in the very fabric of the air around me. The machine wasn't just a doorway. It was a mirror, a reflection of my own mind, my own soul. The hunter took a step closer, its form solidifying with every movement. I could see it more clearly now, its face a void, its limbs unnaturally long and angular. It raised a hand, and I felt the air ripple around me, pulling me toward the machine. "You must decide," the voice said. "Decide what?" I shouted, my voice cracking under the weight of my panic. "To face yourself, or to run forever?" The light of the machine pulsed faster, brighter, its hum rising to a deafening crescendo. The hunter loomed closer, its shadow swallowing the room inch by inch. My reflection in the machine's surface stared back at me, its expression one of quiet desperation. I reached out, my hand trembling as it moved toward the swirling core of the machine. The air grew colder, the light brighter, until I could no longer tell where I ended and the machine began. In that moment, I understood. The hunter was not my enemy. It was my shadow, my fear, the part of me I had refused to confront. The asylum wasn't a prison. It was a crucible, a place to face the darkest corners of myself and emerge whole. The machine's light consumed me, and for a brief, agonizing moment, I felt everything: the weight of my memories, the depth of my fears, the truths I had buried deep within myself. And then, silence. When I opened my eyes, I was standing in the middle of an empty field. The asylum was gone, the hunter nowhere to be seen. The air was crisp and clean, the sky above a pale, forgiving blue. But the silence wasn't empty. It was peaceful. And for the first time, I felt free.